Picture this. A sleepy, nearly abandoned port in northern Australia is transformed into a busy trade hub after an overseas company signs a 99-year lease. That company spent hundreds of millions fixing the place. Fast forward, Australia's Prime Minister publicly says he will force the lease to be cancelled, and if nobody else buys the port, the government will use taxpayer money to buy it back. The headline number people are talking about? More than $3 billion in potential compensation. That's the shock. A legally signed agreement, a 99-year commercial lease, suddenly on the chopping block. Think of it like signing a mortgage for a house and, years later, the town council saying, "We'll take the house from you and pay whatever we feel like." The stakes aren't small. The original winning bid was roughly $320 million, and the operator has since poured in hundreds of millions more to rebuild docks, roads, and equipment. The port now supports thousands of jobs and brings big tax revenue to the region. Why would a democratic government risk tearing up a long-term contract and possibly writing a multi-billion-dollar check? Is it national security, election politics, outside pressure, or something else entirely? Over the next sections, we'll rewind to the port's past, walk through the 2015 deal, follow the political timeline, and break down the legal, economic, and diplomatic fallout, so you can judge whether this is a justified action or a costly political stunt. To understand why this is such a big deal, we need to rewind. Before the headlines and political drama, Darwin Port was far from the bustling hub we see today. In fact, just over a decade ago, it was almost written off as a lost cause. Located in Australia's far north, Darwin is isolated, a region with vast land, scorching heat, and a small population. The local economy was weak, and the port's infrastructure was falling apart. According to an official audit in 2012, nearly 70% of the port's equipment was aged or near scrap condition, and annual cargo throughput had dropped to just 2.7 million tons. Think of it like an old car that's been sitting in a garage for years. Rust on the frame, flat tires, engine barely turning over. The Northern Territory government didn't have the money to fix it, but they didn't want to see it die either. So, in 2015, they decided to lease Darwin Port to outside investors, hoping someone would step in with the funds and expertise to rebuild it. On paper, it sounded simple: open bidding, attract capital, and revive the port. But in reality, this was a massive gamble. Rebuilding a port from the ground up meant reconstructing roads, repairing shoreline structures, upgrading cranes, storage systems, and digital networks, all at enormous cost. So why would anyone want to invest in such a struggling port? The answer lies in geography. Darwin sits on Australia's northwestern coastline, facing the Timor Sea. From there, ships can travel northeast through Van Diemen Gulf into the Arafura Sea, and then out toward the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the closest Australian ports to Asia, closer to Jakarta or Singapore than to Sydney. That location makes Darwin a potential bridge between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, a vital link for shipping, trade, and energy routes. To put it simply, what looks like a small remote port on a map is actually a strategic crossroads in the global trade network, and that's exactly why one company from China decided to take a chance on it. In 2015, after months of open bidding, a private Chinese company called Landbridge Group made a bold move. While over 60 investment teams had shown interest, most backed out once they realized the cost and complexity of rebuilding Darwin Port. Landbridge, however, saw potential where others saw risk. The company offered $320 million for a 99-year lease, which the Northern Territory government quickly approved. For Australia, this was seen as a win at the time. A struggling public asset now had private funding and international backing to turn things around. The deal followed every legal and commercial procedure, and both sides were satisfied. But Landbridge didn't stop there. Once it took over, it began pouring money into upgrades, rebuild port roads, expand storage areas, replace outdated cranes, and install new digital control systems, building a specialized yard for refrigerated containers, up to 260 units, and other core facilities that boosted efficiency and cargo capacity. The results were dramatic. Annual cargo throughput jumped from 16 million tons in 2015 to over 30 million tons by 2024, nearly doubling in less than a decade. By 2024, Darwin Port had also generated 1.2 billion Australian dollars in tax revenue for the Northern Territory, accounting for roughly 17% of the region's total fiscal income. Beyond the numbers, it created over 2,000 local jobs and revitalized surrounding industries like logistics, storage, and shipping. You could say Darwin Port was reborn. What was once a decaying dock became a modern gateway linking Australia directly to Asia's trade network. Even during tough economic times, like in 2024, when Landbridge recorded a book loss of around 120 million Australian dollars due to global fluctuations, the port's cargo volume still increased by 8%, setting a new record. So, by every practical measure, trade, employment, infrastructure, and revenue, Landbridge had turned Darwin Port into a success story. Yet, despite all of this progress, a storm was quietly brewing behind the scenes. Even though the Darwin Port lease was completely legal and honestly widely praised at first, the political winds in Australia began to shift soon after. What started as a straightforward business agreement slowly transformed into a symbol of national debate about sovereignty, security, and loyalty to Western allies. The first big change came in 2018, when then Prime Minister Scott Morrison took office. Around this time, Australia's relationship with China began to, well, cool. As trade disputes grew and Western nations started pushing back on Chinese investment, critics in Canberra began calling Darwin Port a strategic risk. They argued that having a Chinese company manage a port so close to Australia's military facilities could pose a threat, even though there was zero evidence of any wrongdoing. By 2020, tensions had reached their lowest point. China had restricted imports of Australian coal, and diplomacy between the two countries nearly froze. The Morrison government jumped on that moment to order a full national security review of the Darwin Port lease. Officials said they would assess whether Landbridge's control over the port endangered Australia's defence interests. But after months of review, no security concerns were found. The port continued operating normally, inspections continued as usual, and the matter faded, at least for a while. Then came 2022. A new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, from the Labour Party, was elected. At first, he tried to mend ties with Beijing, prioritizing trade recovery and stability. He paused the review of Darwin Port, signaling a return to pragmatism. For a moment, it looked like the issue had finally been settled. But politics has a way of resurrecting old controversies. By April 2025, just weeks before a major federal election, Albanese stunned the public by announcing that his government planned to forcibly take back the Darwin Port lease. He promised that even if no private buyer came forward, the government would use public funds to buy it back. His justification? The same old reason: national security. Many analysts saw the timing as no coincidence. Polls showed that the Labour Party was in a tight race with the Conservative opposition. Taking a tough stance on China could sway nationalist voters, especially those worried about foreign control of critical infrastructure. But there's another layer to this story: pressure from allies. Darwin Port sits just 15 kilometers from a US Marine Corps base, a critical part of Washington's Indo-Pacific defense strategy. In a 2024 Pentagon report, the US even listed Darwin Port as a key supply node for its military network and pledged $300 million in funding for Australia's military facilities, on the condition that Canberra regain control of the port. So, while Albanese's move looked patriotic on the surface, it also aligned perfectly with US strategic goals in the Pacific. The result? A commercial deal was now caught in the crossfire of politics, elections, and global strategy. Now that Australia has announced plans to take back Darwin Port, it's facing a harsh truth. Contracts like this aren't easy to break. The 99-year lease that Landbridge Group signed in 2015 wasn't some informal handshake deal. It was a legally tendered commercial contract, approved under Australian law and witnessed by international auditors. Every step of the process was public, regulated, and validated. So, if the Australian government now wants to forcibly terminate that agreement, it's entering dangerous legal territory. Under the terms of the lease, if one party unilaterally breaks the contract, they must compensate the other party for not only the original investment, but also the expected future profits. When you add it all up, the initial $320 million payment, over $1 billion Australian dollars in upgrades, and projected long-term returns, experts estimate that Australia could owe more than $3 billion in total compensation. That's not pocket change. It's roughly the same as what Australia spends every year on public housing nationwide. Imagine taxpayers footing that bill simply because a government decided to reverse its own earlier approval, and the financial fallout wouldn't stop there. Darwin Port has become a core pillar of the Northern Territory's economy, contributing nearly 17% of local tax revenue and supporting thousands of jobs. If the lease is scrapped, port operations could slow or stall during legal disputes, cutting off vital income for the region. Economists warn that the Northern Territory's GDP could shrink by at least 1.2%, a big hit for a region already reliant on external investment. Beyond money, there's also reputation. If Australia tears up a long-term contract that was legally recognized and politically supported for years, it risks sending a chilling message to future investors. Your deals here aren't safe. That could scare off billions in potential foreign investment, not just from China, but from anywhere. Even under international law, Australia's position is shaky, unless it can present solid evidence that the Darwin Port lease poses a real national security threat, something never proven in a decade of reviews. Any attempt to reclaim it could be seen as politically motivated expropriation, which is illegal under global trade and investment agreements. So, while the move might win applause from nationalist voters or political allies abroad, the financial and legal costs could far outweigh any short-term political gain.